Second video lecture for the reproductive system anatomy. We're going to cover what's happening inside the female. And to start off with, if you're following along with your anatomy study guide for the female, the primary reproductive or sexual organ in the female are the ovaries, her two ovaries, because those are the sites where the egg cells are produced, which we'll be covering a lot more over on the physiology side. And let's actually, all right, so here on this cross-sectional diagram from a female, this is showing one of the two ovaries. So this is her left ovary here. And of course, part of it's being hidden. This is the uterus that you're seeing right in here. And if we look inside an ovary, this is actually a diagram from your textbook, there's a whole lot going on inside the ovaries, which we'll be covering very extensively over on the physiology side. But if you cut an ovary open in cross-section and looked inside, all of these different structures would likely exist in there. They wouldn't be nice and organized like they are here, but we're going to take a look at these. First of all, the large cells that you see here in the diagrams, they're right there, those big cells. They're a little bit smaller over in here, kind of in the center. Those are the oocytes. All right, so those are your egg cells. They're not mature egg cells yet. There's one right in there as well. Here's one when it pops out of the ovary at ovulation and begins its journey down a fallopian tube where it may or may not encounter sperm cells and become fertilized. So those are the cells that have not yet become a fully mature egg or ovum. They're called oocytes while they're in the ovaries. But then if you notice, if you look, it's not too hard to notice that these oocytes, erase those, are covered or housed in these roundish structures of different sizes. Here's a great big one over here. So all of the pink stuff you see on there, those are that's a housing for the oocyte that's composed of smaller cells called granulosa cells that we'll be talking about their functions over on the physiology side. But those larger structures that enclose the oocytes are called follicles or ovarian follicles. And they go through different stages of maturation. Typically during each female's monthly ovarian cycle that takes place, one of them becomes very large, and that's called a mature follicle, and it has some other names as well. It's so large it actually has a fluid-filled space on the inside. But then that ruptures, which is being depicted over here, and that releases the oocyte into a fallopian tube, and that's the location where sperm cells will find it if sperm cells are going to fertilize that egg. All right, and then notice we had this ruptured follicle here, and it has all these leftover cells. Those leftover cells undergo changes, and they take on this appearance, and later this appearance when it grows a little bit larger, and it has kind of a yellowish coloration. So both of these are depicting different stages of what's known as a corpus luteum. Luteum refers to yellow. Corpus refers to a body, like a corpse. So it's a yellow body inside the ovary. And this is a very important feature inside the ovaries. These develop during each ovarian cycle of a female, and they secrete estrogen and progesterone hormones that are needed to prepare the inside lining of the uterus to accept an embryo that will attach if a pregnancy occurs. If a pregnancy does not occur, the corpus luteum dies and takes on a whitish appearance and becomes a corpus albicans. And that's what you're seeing there on the ovary. So just keep in mind this diagram from your textbook of the ovary. It's kind of giving you a cartoonish depiction of what's going on in the ovary. Things are not this organized, and you wouldn't necessarily see each and everything depicted on here at one time, and certainly not in this kind of organized fashion, but this is depicting the different structures that you can find inside an ovary. Okay, I'm going to flip over to visible body, and we're going to take a look at the female reproductive anatomy on visible body. Oops, I got to change genders though first. Well, not me personally, but oh, here we go, switch gender. But here on visible body, we got to change over to the female. All right, looks like this will probably be a pretty good view inside the female. So just like with the male, the other organs of the abdominopelvic cavity have been removed so that we can see things a little bit more clearly. And okay, so right there and right over there, those are your two ovaries on the left and the right sides. You can kind of rotate around this way as well and see where they're located. Ovary, ovary. I'm actually going, let me deselect those. Let me get rid of some of these ligaments. I think I'm going to tell those to go away completely. And I'm going to get rid of the coccyx and some other features as well. Okay. I want to get rid of that as well, too, so we can see more of what's going on in here. Okay, so the ovaries, notice the ovaries, there's a structure right there and right over there. Those are ligaments that help anchor the ovaries to the uterus. This is the uterus. And there are other ligaments. We'll see some pictures of those over on the physiology side as well that connect all of these different organs together and help hold them in place inside the abdominopelvic cavity. All right, so right here and right over here, each of those is a fallopian tube. So those extend from, they don't actually make physical contact with the ovaries, but they get pretty close. And they extend and connect to the uterus. Now if we zoom in on a fallopian tube, let me slide this over. Let me deselect our fallopian tube. This portion right in here, where it gets wider, fallopian tube there takes on a wider shape. That's called the infundibulum of the fallopian tube. And then it has these finger-like projections that kind of cup the ovary. They don't actually make physical contact with it. So you've got that over here on this side as well. Those are called the fimbriae, or the fimbriae, spelled F-I-M-B-R-I-A-E. All right, so when that mature follicle inside an ovary ruptures and releases a secondary, releases an oocyte. It's actually called a secondary oocyte, but we'll talk about that over on the physiology side. It will float past these fimbriae. These fimbriae kind of help wave it into the fallopian tube, and then it starts traveling down the fallopian tube. If sperm cells are going to fertilize it, the sperm cells actually have to swim all the way up here and into a fallopian tube to find the oocyte in the fallopian tube. Okay, and then this organ that you see here, of course, is the uterus. And this is part of the uterus here. And this is also part of the, oops, well, they didn't really model this very well on visible body, so we'll have to take a look at it on the diagram from your textbook. But that's all the uterus. Kind of give you some perspective from different views. The domed portion of the uterus up in here is called the fundus of the uterus, where it looks like a dome. Let me deselect that. So this domed portion right in there, that's the fundus. And then the main portion of the uterus down in here is the body. So I'll rotate that around so you can see the body. That's your main portion. Now there is another section of the uterus called the cervix that connects the uterus to the vagina, which is down in here. And then the vagina obviously has an opening to the outside. So if we're looking at this view here, this is called the vaginal orifice, which opens up to the outside of the body. And the vagina, of course, is this passageway that connects to the uterus. And on this view as well, if we deselect that, I think we took a look at this over on the urinary reproductive side. There's an opening right there as well, right in there. That's your external urethral orifice. So we were talking about that over in the urinary anatomy lectures. That's actually anterior. If you think about a female standing in anatomical position, the external urethral orifice is anterior to the vaginal orifice. Let's see. I think that may be all I want to take a look at here on visible body. Let me pull up a slightly different view for a second. Here we go. I want to pull this view up just to illustrate again for you the relationship between, here's the urinary bladder and here's the uterus up in here. So the uterus, let me hide the muscular system, make it go away. And actually I'm going to hide the pelvic girdle as well. And I'm going to make these tissues go away too. Here's your uterus. Dome portion up in here is the fundus. And there's your bladder. So the uterus is superior to the bladder in the female, and it's also a little bit posterior. The bladder is extending out in an anterior direction. And here's another view. Here's the urethra in the female, and then back here, there's the vagina in the female. So you can see how they're positioned relative to each other. Okay, and let's take a look at this cross-sectional diagram from your textbook of the female reproductive structures and what we're seeing here. Okay, so of course, the white structure there, that's the ovary, and then here's your uterine tube or fallopian tube, or oviduct is another name for that. Where it's wider, right in there, that's called the infundibulum. And those little finger-like projections are the fimbriae, or the fimbriae. If you've had microbiology, or if you're going to be taking microbiology soon, you'll hear about fimbriae or fimbriae on certain types of bacteria. They're little finger-like projections on the surfaces of some bacteria that help them attach to things. So you will hear that term, again, used in a different way. Okay, so in our cross-section view here of the uterus, the domed portion of the uterus up in here, let me erase what I've already labeled. The domed area is the fundus. And then all of this area is the body of the uterus, the main portion of the uterus. That's where a developing embryo or a fetus will be located inside the body. So there's not much space in there in a non-pregnant uterus, but of course that's going to expand dramatically when a woman becomes pregnant. And down in here, this portion of the uterus that contacts the vagina, there's the vagina. That portion is called the cervix. And the cervix has two openings. So right in here, there's an opening from the cervix into the body of the uterus, and that is called the internal os. Os is referring to opening there. And then right in here, there's an opening from the cervix into the vagina, and that is called an external os. The external os is normally covered with a very thick mucus. So when sperm cells get deposited in here in the vagina, they normally cannot get past that thick plug of mucus to move and swim up the cervix into the body of the uterus, enter a fallopian tube, because in the fallopian tube is actually where the sperm cells go to find an oocyte to fertilize. Okay, the uterus also has 3 layers All right, I guess I didn't pause when I thought I had paused there. Sorry about that. There are 3 layers to the uterus. Okay, so there's an outer covering. They have names that are similar to the 3 layers of the heart. There's an outer covering which is called the perimetrium. So rather than the pericardium, it's called the perimetrium on the uterus. And then you have this muscular layer. That's a very thick layer. And that's called the myometrium rather than the myocardium. And it is composed mostly of smooth muscle cells that will contract when the uterus needs to contract. And then finally you have an inner lining, this light pink lining that you see there on the diagram. That is called the endometrium. And the endometrium is the layer of the uterus that we'll talk the most about over on the physiology side, because that's where an embryo is going to implant if a woman becomes pregnant. That is also, the endometrium itself is divided up into 2 layers, and the layer facing the lumen of the uterus, the space inside the uterus, is the portion that gets shed each month with a menstrual cycle. So with each monthly menstrual cycle, a female builds a new, what's called a functional layer of the endometrium, which becomes very rich in blood vessels and glands that will secrete nourishing fluids to developing fetus or embryo. And if no pregnancy occurs, that gets shed off, and then it gets rebuilt during the next uterine cycle. Okay, on the vagina here that we're seeing in cross-section, a couple of features here. Notice how the vagina kind of wraps around the cervix, right there and right there. Each of those is called a fornix, and fornices is a plural term, so right there and right there. Interestingly, those fornices actually provide access during some surgical procedures to the abdominopelvic cavity. Up in here, you can go through the vagina and up a fornix, and that gives you, the tissue there is pretty thin between the fornix and the abdominopelvic cavity, so that can be used in some cases for surgical access. The vagina itself has 3 layers. So on this diagram, there's an inner pink layer, and so we've heard before about mucosal layers of various tissues. So the vagina is also covered with a mucous membrane along with the other organs of the major organs of the reproductive tract. So that inner lining is called the mucosa, or the mucosal layer, or the vaginal mucosa. It's a mucous membrane. So that light pink line that you see there. Okay, and then the thicker, darker red tissues that you see there in cross-section, that's the muscular layer of the vagina. And if you look closely beyond the muscular layer, there's another lighter colored border, and that is called the fibrous layer. So that contains some fibrous connective tissues that are wrapping around the muscular layer of the vagina. So those are your 3 major layers of the vagina itself. Okay, let's see if I've left anything out. I don't think so. I think we're ready to move to the external structures, which are not modeled all that well on visible body. So we're just going to take a look at these on the diagram from your textbook. Okay, so these are the external female structures. And so all of them together, all of this is referred to as the vulva, the external female reproductive structures. Okay, so of course right there, that's the opening to the anal canal. The fatty mound up here that is covered in pubic hair, that is called the mons pubis. So you have a fatty cushion that's located there. That's where the pubic hair is located, and that is considered to be the part of the vulva. All the external structures together are called the vulva. All right, and then these outer folds right there and right there, those are called the labia majora. Uh, Labia refers to lips. Those are the outer lips of the vulva. And then these inner folds that you see right there and right there, those are called the labia minora. Okay, and when you fold back the labia minora, there is a surface inside there. I'm coloring in with this pen. That surface in there is called the vestibule. And a lot of students have trouble visualizing the vestibule. The vestibule is the surface on which the vaginal orifice is located and on which the external urethral orifice is located. Okay, the little knot-like structure right in there, up at the top of the vestibule, that's the clitoris. So that's composed of erectile tissue that's analogous to the erectile tissues of the penis in the male. So the clitoris fills with blood just like those spongy erectile tissues do in the penis of the male when a female is sexually excited. Okay, and then finally, it's kind of hard to see on here, those little dots right there and right there, those are called the vestibular glands. And they're also known as Bartholin's glands. That was the person who discovered these glands. Those are analogous to the bulbourethral glands in the male that secrete a lubricating fluid for sexual intercourse. The vestibular glands in the female also secrete a lubricating fluid for sexual intercourse, and they open up onto the vestibule right down there at the lower portion of the vaginal orifice. All right, so I think that's everything on the external female anatomy. Now let's move on to the features of the breast you need to know. So within the breasts, you have lots of fatty tissue in there. So everything you see there in yellow, that represents fatty tissue. But then all of this is a mammary gland. Everything I just outlined there. Those are your milk-producing glands in the breasts, and they begin producing milk under the signaling from prolactin, an anterior pituitary hormone. And then if you remember from way back when at the beginning of the semester, oxytocin stimulates contraction of smooth muscle tissues around these glands that squeeze the milk that has already been produced towards the nipple. So those were a couple of hormones. We've talked a little bit about mammary glands earlier in the semester. The mammary glands are divided up into lobes. So there's a lobe, there's a lobe, there's another lobe. You've got some connective tissues between each lobe. The lobes are divided up into smaller compartments, and those are called lobules, like little miniature lobes. And now if you zoomed into the lobules at a microscopic level, you would find alveoli, these little clover-like structures which have a similar name to the alveoli of the lungs. You can kind of see that the structures look similar. And within those you have a layer of cells that produce the milk and secrete it into these little microscopic compartments. And all of the milk that gets produced travels through little ducts, and those combine together to form these larger, right in here, and right in here, and here, and over here. Those are called lactiferous ducts. Some sources just refer to those as the mammary ducts, but then other sources call those lactiferous ducts, so we'll just go with lactiferous. Notice how those lactiferous ducts widen right there, and right there. Each of those is a lactiferous ampulla or a lactiferous sinus. Ampullae would be plural, sinuses would be plural. So that's just a widening. We've seen that term before. That's where a duct gets wider and becomes a storage compartment. That's called an ampulla, or can also be referred to as a sinus. And then beyond there, those ampullae or sinuses lead to the opening at the nipple through which the milk will pass. So they're little short ducts that extend from the ampullae to the opening in the nipple. So of course there's your, I think we all know that's a nipple. The darkened area around the nipple is called the areola, that more darkly pigmented skin. Okay, I think those are all the parts of the mammary glands in the breast that we need to know. The last thing we're going to take a look at here, just a few parts. The last part of the reproductive system, you're going to talk about pregnancy and development of embryos and fetuses inside the uterus. And so we just got a few things that we're going to include as part of the required anatomy over here. So this is a pretty young fetus, not very far along in development, just a few months. And so that organ, of course, is the uterus. This is a pregnant uterus. All right, so down in here, this portion of the uterus here is the cervix. And then the domed area up in here is the fundus. And the rest of it is the body, the main portion of the uterus, as we've talked about already. And then obviously this is our fetus, called an embryo earlier in development. The blue line right here, that is representing the amnion, which is the membrane, the clear, transparent membrane that that forms your amniotic sac. And it's filled with amniotic fluid on the inside. And of course, there's your umbilical cord. The umbilical cord contains arteries and veins of the fetus. Blood gets carried from the fetus through the umbilical cord up here to the placenta. So this is the placenta that has been cut open in cross section. And then in the placenta, the blood of the fetus gets distributed through little bitty tiny blood vessels. Blood from the mother is contained, see these darker areas on here? Those are blood-filled compartments that contain the mother's blood. So the blood of the fetus, the blood of the mother do not actually make physical contact with each other, but they get close enough together that substances can move back and forth between the mother's blood and the fetus's blood. So that includes oxygen gas is getting picked up from the mother's blood to send to the fetus. Carbon dioxide from the fetus is taken away by the mother's blood. The mother's blood is bringing nutrients like glucose and amino acids, things like that that the fetus needs for its very rapid growth and development that are taking place. And then blood vessels inside the umbilical cord will carry those substances back to the fetus so that it can have its supply of oxygen gas and all the good nutrients that it needs. But that whole structure there is called the placenta, and the placenta is a combination of tissues from the developing embryo or fetus and the mother. All right, and so I believe that finishes up the female reproductive anatomy. So now you're ready to move on over to the physiology side for the reproductive system.